Good morning. I heard everyone say that they were wide awake, right? Long night at the pubs last night. Welcome to day 2 of BriForum. How many of this is your first BriForum? What do you think so far? Yeah? Not bad? Well, hopefully we'll keep it going today. My name is Mike Nelson. I work for a company called Nginx. You may have seen one of my colleagues give a presentation, Rick Dillinger. He's also worked for Nginx, and you can reach me at any of these addresses. Today we're going to be talking about Hyper-V for VMware administrators. And the one thing that we have to understand about today is that if my remote worked, which it isn't. Oh. Ha! This is a crash course. And what this means is that we're not going to cover everything. Okay? If we covered everything, we'd be here for a week. And the biggest, cover the highlights, go over some of the things that you really should understand if you are administrators or you're currently VMware folks that will administer Hyper-V. It's going to be more of the basics of what you do every day. I'm not going to go really deep technical. I'm going to show you some deep technical slides, but we're going to gloss right over those, cover some of the high points, and go on from there. Okay? So the topics we're going to cover is I got some quick questions for you first off. Then we're going to go a little bit of history, and then there's just not enough time to cover all the technical details, like I said. So we'll go over some of those, the differences and similarities between Hyper-V and VMware, vSphere, and then the vAdmin, which I call VMware administrators, and managing the mess. So the first thing I want to talk about is questions for you. Now, I myself was brought up on way back. I've been doing this for 25 some years. Yeah, that's how old I am. And we started out in the old Linux and punch card Novell days. I don't know if anybody has lived through those days of the old SCO Unix and Solaris. And I'm showing my age, I guess. Nobody else is like going, that's me. But how many people here work with VMware today? So are you actually administrators? Are you actually the folks on the front lines that do the vMotions and the creation of the machines and things like that? Yeah? Okay. Is anybody else involved in just Hyper-V today? Has anybody worked with Hyper-V? You've worked with it, looked at it, kind of played with it a little bit, something like that? Okay. Anybody else use any other kind of hypervisor in their data center? Anybody use Zen Server or anybody use VirtualBox or anything like that? Which one? Zen Server. Do you? Zen Server? Oh, you use KVM? Okay, good, good. That's actually better than VirtualBox as a production, but that's interesting because I've done this presentation twice before. I'm going to be doing it again in Chicago, and it's always interesting the feedback I get back about the hypervisors that are in the data centers. One of the big things that a conversation I've had with people is how VMware 5 years ago, think about VMware, well, actually 8 years ago now, okay? They owned everything. The hypervisor was theirs, starting with GSX. After GSX came out, okay, that was it. They were the king of the hill, they were the top of the heap, and no one could touch them. Well, they always looked down at everyone else, okay? At that time, Red Hat did have a hypervisor, okay? So, but they were playing it low. They had it, but they really weren't marketing it. They weren't really pushing it. They didn't have a lot of a foundation around it, but they did have one. Zen was also, just the Zen, not Zen Server, but Zen was also available at the time, okay? Contrary to common belief, VMware did not create the hypervisor, okay? Who created the hypervisor, actually? Anybody know? Who's that? IBM, exactly. IBM created the first hypervisor. and it was in their system suite, and that's back in the 1981, I believe, is when they first marketed it. I'm not sure. Anyways, I always talk about the big dog versus the small dog, David versus Goliath. And it was always VMware against everyone else. And if you think about it, my goodness, the microphone came Think of this person as this dog. I don't even know what kind of dog that is, but think of that dog as VMware. I mean, Hyper-V, and that is VMware. Hyper-V came out. Everybody laughed at it. VMware especially just pounded VMware, saying, "You guys don't know what the hell you're doing." Understand, Hyper-V was written from the ground up. Okay, Microsoft didn't buy anybody to write Hyper-V. Okay, they may have bought developers and things like that from other companies, but they didn't actually go out and buy anything. Neither did VMware. VMware built theirs also from the ground up. Okay, they may have bought other companies along the way.
Didn't they steal it from Xen?
I'm sorry?
Didn't they steal it from Xen? I mean,
Well, like I said, they didn't actually take.
They were very inspiring. Okay.
Exactly, exactly. So if you think of it that way, okay, think of how Hyper-V has evolved. Hyper-V, when Hyper-V version 1 or Hyper-V version 2 was out, things were kind of shaky, kind of a mess. There were still a lot of bad things. You couldn't do vMotions. You couldn't do storage vMotions. Virtual networking was crazy. Storage, you had to do shared clusters, shared clustered volumes and things like that. It was very difficult to manage. A lot of people just did not want to deal with it. But as you come to Hyper-V version 3, things have changed a little bit. Now, 3-4 years ago, I did a presentation in Chicago about multiple hypervisors in the data center. And when I did that, I had a person in the audience who worked for Microsoft who stood up and asked me a question about how Hyper-V couldn't stand up in the data center against some other hypervisors. I wasn't going to get into that conversation. The conversation I was having was around how you, as administrators, are going to handle this situation. Because you can throw all the hypervisors you want into the data center, but how does it affect you? How does it affect your job? And how are you going to handle that? Because you got to remember, if you can't, multitask and be able to work with multiple different environments, you may have to move on or have to go to another company or something like that if your company chooses to have that type of environment. One of the questions I also have is that anyone who is running currently multiple hypervisors in their data center, is that by your choice? You said you had Xen Server also. Is that because of an application requirement or because of an application that came in-house that's owned by, managed by a vendor that requires Xen Server, or what's the reasoning behind having?
They're purely Xen Server. That customer's purely Xen Server.
Oh, really?
They're not mixed.
Not mixed. Okay. Did you say you also?
Yes, right. We have multiple customers, and it's their choice basically to have Xen.
Okay.
Some of it's dictated by cost of licensing.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that soon. But
that's why people look at the cost of their existing infrastructure and hypervisor and go, hang on, what else is out there now?
which brings up an interesting point. There's also the free versions of these hypervisors, right? Hyper-V has a free version. ESXi has a free version. The ESXi hypervisor, right? And necessarily, you have to qualify free, okay? Because it's not exactly free, but it is. Now, it's interesting that you talk about having those multiples because some people are saying, I had one person ask me that he just didn't believe in having multiple hypervisors in a data center. Why would you do that? What's the reasoning for that? My response is, most of the people that I work with, it isn't by their choice. The administrators just have to administer whatever is given them, okay? A lot of times they don't have a say in what they have to administer. They just have to learn it. Somebody else brings it in, somebody else racks and stacks it, or tells you how to rack and stack it, you plug it all in, and then you have to figure out how to administrate it. And more often than not, I've run into people that a financial vendor, okay? Back in the States, we have one called Timberline. And they are notorious for coming in and saying, okay, we're going to give you Timberline, but you have to run it on this. And you have to run it on that. And you have to use a Oracle database backend. And you have to do this, and you have to do that. So the vendor is specifying this infrastructure. Okay, so IT as a service, we start getting into that. But when you look at that overall, it complicates our lives. You know, it makes our jobs a little bit harder, but it also makes it a little bit more exciting, in my opinion, because you get to learn new things, you get to move on. One thing that Microsoft wanted to do when we're talking about that is they wanted to do what they call commoditize the hypervisor. One of their goals was to take the hypervisor and just sell it. Say it's a commodity. It's something that you have to have. It's not something that you necessarily even know you have. Okay? An example. I ran into a customer, and I did not know this, but I ran into a customer that actually has received a product from Microsoft through a vendor. And what it is it's a SKU that Microsoft has that actually pre-packages the Hyper-V hypervisor with IIS and a SQL running together on one box. So it's a single SKU from Microsoft, but it's all packaged together. So you don't even know that you're getting Hyper-V. This customer had no idea. This customer said, oh, we got shipped this on this Dell piece of hardware. We put it in our data center. We turned it on. Okay, we had a person remote in, configure the device, okay, and we just use the application. They don't even know that Hyper-V was running in their data center. They had no idea. And that's the path that Microsoft wanted to go down. Microsoft wanted to say, it really doesn't matter because it's not going to matter that the hypervisor is running in your data center. But the one thing that they didn't think about was you. They didn't say, oh, well, the administrator doesn't matter. You know, they said, we only care about making the sale. We care about, putting that hypervisor in the data center. The administration will come later. That's what they wanted to do. Anybody recognize this? Cisco UCS. Okay. Stack as many VMs as you possibly can on a piece of hardware. Guess what? It all comes as a pre-packaged bundle. You can buy it pre-packaged with the OS, with the hypervisor, with the storage, with everything, all in one. They'll shove it in your data center, plug it in here, plug it into the power, plug it into the network, and you're ready to go. All bundled. How are you going to manage that? Has anybody looked at the UCS management? Does anybody know? Yeah. So something you've done for years in VMware administration, and then all of a sudden you have to look at UCS management and go, holy crap. Now I got to learn this. What's the trend is going is that people are jumping ship, okay? And not necessarily jumping ship to another hypervisor, all right? But they're jumping ship to all of the hypervisors. And the reason for that is because of exactly what I was saying. It's not necessarily your choice what goes in the data center. So let's look at some technical differences, and this is my disclaimer. I apologize for that slide thing. I didn't know I did that. But there are way too many things to talk about, okay? I do recommend highly that you go to this website, virtualizationmatrix.com. On that website, it's an agnostic hypervisor matrix, and what it does is it spells out all the differences, okay? Every little detailed differences along with tips. So if you see something on that site and you click the little blue eye icon, I believe it's a little blue eye icon next to the description of something, it'll actually give you a call out and tell you what that description is. And it'll give it to you for Hyper-V, for Red Hat, for VMware, for Zen. I believe VirtualBox is there. They've got them all listed. Okay, it's a great place to compare all the technical differences of the hypervisors. What we have to look at too is we're actually talking about apples and oranges in some aspects. And this is where we're briefly going to get into the basics of the differences between the two hypervisors. Okay, this is what they call the monolithic design. This is what VMware ESX is based off of. Okay, this is not something that Microsoft made up. This is not something that I made up. This is just the technical architecture of the ESXi, ESX layer. Okay, you can see you have the hardware layer, you have the hypervisor layer, and you have what's called the controlling layer where the VMs actually sit. Okay, one of the things about this is that with VMware, and I'll get into this actually briefly, is VMware, if you notice, doesn't always, you have to go to the VMware compatibility. Has anybody gone to the HAL? And you go to the HAL in order to find out if your brand new spanking HP blade will work with ESXi. Okay, that's because there are specific drivers that have to be written for ESXi to work with hardware. Okay, that's totally the opposite of what Hyper-V does, because they use what's called a microkernelized design. They don't require, okay, specific hardware drivers to work for the hypervisor. All right, they require Windows operating system drivers, but they don't require hypervisor-specific drivers or drivers that were written to talk to the hypervisor layer. Okay, you'll notice you have the hardware layer, you have the hypervisor layer, which is much smaller than the VMware, but look at the control layer. The controlling layer is much larger. Okay, that's the difference between the two. And you look at them side by side, you can see where the VMs sit. You're looking at the main partition. The device drivers sit inside of that controlling layer. What's inside of that controlling layer? That's an operating system. Okay, it's not the hypervisor, it's an operating system. A microkernel design hypervisor requires an operating system. You have the product components, you have the layer, same thing. Product components and the hardware layer. Not much difference between them. You'll see in the file systems, the storage stack, the network, resource scheduling, migration, kind of the same across the hypervisor. Some of the things are code injection in the hypervisor layer can happen in VMware. Okay, requires compatible hardware and device drivers like I mentioned. No security patches or operating system required in the controlling layer. Okay, so you can't get to the controlling layer. It's not possible in ESXi. ESX is a different story. Remember the Service Console in ESX? That's why they got rid of the Service Console in ESX, and they went to ESXi. There's no code injection possible in the hypervisor layer in the microkernelized design. The APIs, there is no API for this. There's no way that an attacker can get at this layer at all. Okay? Not unless they're a Microsoft core developer that wrote the ones and zeros that created this. Then it's probably possible. But there's really no other way possible to get in there. The device drivers do not need to be hypervisor aware, like I mentioned, and the controlling layer requires an OS, which inherently means I'm less secure. Okay? Especially when you're talking about a Windows product. So let's look at some of the deployment options. You're used to deploying ESX today, right? How do you deploy it? You take each machine, you build it from an image, or do you do it one by one off of the media? Or are you actually using auto-deploy? Anybody using auto-deploy now with 5.1? Okay. Is anybody using any of these other methods? The Pixie or USB? I'm sorry? Okay, Altiris, yep. Everybody still, some people obviously are still using media. They drop a DVD in there, the 5.1, and then fire it up. It only takes, what, 5 minutes to install, I think, or something like that, and then you're up and running. It's just, you don't get the whole, exact mirror image or booting off of a master image scenario. It's not completely automated, which, the world is going to. But you can just see the differences. There's a little bit of difference. Really, from the Hyper-V standpoint, you're using Windows deployment tools. From ESX, they're using their own deployment tools. They both use Pixie. They can use DVD. They can use USB. They just have different tools. Okay? These are tools you're going to have to understand if you are going to deploy Hyper-V, though. You can do it one by one. Just enable the role, go in and change the Hyper-V settings, create the virtual switch, blah, 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 blah. Or you can automate it all with the deployment toolkit. Okay, just like you would automate a Windows operating system deployment. Some technical comparisons. I've highlighted a few of them. I'm not going to cover all of them, but there are some that need to be called out. If you look at the Hyper-V version 3, for some reason, Microsoft got really pissed off about the whole VMware coming back and saying, you guys can't match what we can do when they had version 2. Okay? And what they did was they just went and blew all the doors off on VMware on capacity for some reason when they came out with 3.0. I mean, look at this. Look at the difference in that. Logical processors, 320 logical processors that you can have. You can have 4 terabyte of physical memory. vSphere Enterprise, 2 terabyte. Okay? Some of the others, active VMs per host, 1,024 compared to 512. Okay, now, anybody here ever going to have 1,024 active VMs per host? I really feel bad for you if you do. That's ridiculous, okay? The other one is maximum VMs in a cluster. You have that many VMs in a cluster, you're screwing yourself. I mean, you're pretty much screwing yourself right out of a job because that is just crazy. That's just a crazy number. This is more reasonable, but even that is high. I wouldn't do it. I mean, you're talking about, you can have what, 64? I don't even have it on this slide. You can have 64 nodes per cluster now, I believe. Think about it, 64 hosts divided by 8,000. That's crazy. And then supported operating systems. This is where Hyper-V gets killed. Just whacked. And I'll go through some of that. Resource comparison, dynamic memory, everybody's got it. Resource meeting, quality of service, data center bridging, everybody's got it. Okay, not much difference there. There are some differences in terms of, you have to notice that Hyper-V 2012, there is no difference between the free Hyper-V version and the one that you would pay for inside of Server 2012. Okay, there's no light version of Hyper-V. There might be light management of Hyper-V, but there's no light version of it, where VMware makes a light version of their hypervisor. You can't do everything in there that you can in the full version. Okay, so all of you that are used to using either Essentials or what is it called now? Essentials Plus, I think. Enterprise Plus, Enterprise. You get different things, right? There are different tiers. Well, the ESXi hypervisor is like the lowest tier. I think it used to be called Foundation years ago. But it's like the lowest one that gets the least. We'll look at guest migrations, which everybody wants. The 2 I called out were obviously the 1 gig simultaneous and the 10 gig simultaneous. Everybody on 10 gig now? No, I only see like 2 people going, yeah. Go to 10 gig. It's awesome, especially when you're doing vMotions. They're like really quick. So the nice thing is that on Hyper-V you can do unlimited. Well, you can kind of do within the technical capabilities of the networking hardware. Well, yeah, if you try and do, what, 10 vMotions at once and you only have a 1 gig pipe, it's going to be a bottleneck. And then Hyper-V, VMware, you can do 8 and 4. Unified vMotion, I think you can do 12 now in 5.1 U1. I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up. Storage options. This is a little bit different because everybody's always said that Hyper-V was different because you can't use CIFS. That was one of the things, okay? But they have SMB 3.0 now, all right, which is, I've used it, and it's kind of fast, much better than 2.0, but it still has some quirks to it. It's 3.0. vSphere, NAS, and NFS, which Hyper-V does not have. So how many of you are running all of your vSphere on NFS? Gonna have a problem. The other ones I like are obviously link clones, which Hyper-V cannot do and refuses to do. They have something called differencing disk, which they think is link clones, but it's not. And then they have the lazy eager zeroed. Really, the only reason that vSphere had this, does anybody know why they actually implemented this in the first place? Well, one of the reasons they did. Pardon me?
Fault tolerance?
Well, fault tolerance is one. The other one is to solve what problem? Misalignment. One was to solve misalignment issues. And that's because they started their whole VMFS file system, VMFS 3. Actually, it was 3.1 or something, 3.5, I don't remember. And the SAN vendors were like, weren't jiving together. They weren't communicating. And they kept on coming up with the wrong stripe value and the block level values and things like that. So some of the comparisons, again, called out. Anybody use virtual fiber channel, by the way? No? I just used that like a month ago. I was testing something. That is really cool. You can actually simulate fiber channel. It's really awesome. The 4K KB disk support, which obviously helps the whole alignment issue. Maximum virtual disk size. I don't know why you would have a virtual machine that is 64 terabyte in size. I don't know. And then storage pooling. One of the things about storage pooling is you can really do it in vSphere, even though this says no because they don't really call it that, the VAI. Okay, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Scalability, this is where I said the nodes per cluster, yep, 64. Pretty much everything else is copacetic. I mean, max size guest cluster file-based 64 nodes. You know, yeah, when you start getting into those things, you're really getting deep. But to the average administrator, that doesn't mean much, unless you're dealing with something like a high-end Oracle backend that requires this, that, and the other thing, or SAP, OneWorld, JD Edwards, things like that. Sometimes they get into that. High availability, incremental backups, replication, NIC teaming. NIC teaming was a big bitch by people when they were bringing out versions of vSphere. Does anybody use NIC teaming now? Do you? Yeah? Because people complained about that up and down, that they couldn't do NIC teaming just like they could on an HP piece of hardware or a Dell piece of hardware or something like that. So they put it in, and now they're finding out that people aren't really using it. Why? Because they've got 10 gig links, you know, and they've got the redundant virtual switches. So the extensible vSwitch is pretty much the difference on the networking comparison. The big thing about that is that what Microsoft says is that the switch on VMware side is something called replaceable. And the reason for that is because you can't really extend it. You can only pull it out and replace it with something else. So you have the virtual switch, which is a standard virtual switch. You have the distributed switch. You have the Cisco Nexus. And now you have one other one. I can't remember if it's HP or who it is. But the only way to upgrade or to add capacity or to extend that switch is to pull it out and put in a rip and replace. Pull one out and put one in and move everything over. Where the virtual switch is dynamic. You can actually add on to that switch, that existing switch. Integrating the virtual machines, everybody's seen this before, setting up the VMware tools in a VMware machine. In Hyper-V, they have the same thing. When you go in, they have something called integration services, okay, which is same thing as VMware tools. It allows the operating system to talk to the back-end management layer, the hypervisor management layer. And one thing that's common between both VMware and Hyper-V is that they love Linux. Okay, so Microsoft has turned a leaf and said, hey, Linux ain't so bad. I mean, 5 years ago, Steve Ballmer sat up on stage and said, Linux is the devil. Well, Linux ain't so bad today, okay? So they work pretty good with Linux machines. I've been running CentOS machines on both of them. I mean, I have one CentOS machine that's been up for like 300 days. You know, it's never gone down. It just keeps going. The biggest thing that we need to talk about, though, is operating system compatibility, because this is one of the things you'll be dealing with when you have a request for a new machine. They come out and they say, well, we need server 2008 R2. This is the only thing that'll work on. Or it has to be this brand of Linux, or this generation of Linux. Or it has to be a box that supports Windows XP. Believe it or not, there are some enterprise applications out there that still run on a Windows XP box. I have about 3 customers that have that. And the reason for that is because they don't want to upgrade their software because they're scared to death they're going to lose their data. Or the vendor that actually created the software is gone, and they don't want to take the time to go out and find something else. Okay, so they're still running XP boxes in production that run their line of business applications or mission critical applications. vSphere, look at that. Look at all the Linux you can run on vSphere. Unbelievable. You name it, you can run it. I don't even know what ecom station is. Must be like a POS or something. I don't even know what it is. And I'd be scared to death to run this. I mean, who wants to run Java Desktop? Oh my God. Imagine the patches that have to go on there. What's that?
So that's all it'll be doing all day.
Yeah. Look at the Windows. Look at all the Windows versions they support. Anybody remember this one? Anybody remember that? I've actually built a machine with that. And I've got a machine at my office. So I've never turned it on, but I built it. It's kind of cool. You can run DOS. I don't know what the hell for, but you can run it. I don't know why anybody would ever want to run ME or 3.1 ever again in their lives. But
Cluster of 3.1 hosts just to
yeah.
get an old notes environment going because they need to for data.
Oh, notes.
Yeah.
Why is it always notes comes back and haunts everybody? Boy, does that app suck. I mean, it just
Keeps on going.
yeah, and doesn't go away. You can just, you can try and flush it out of an organization all you want, but there's always a little piece sitting there.
So many customized databases in it that
Yeah.
you just can't even think of a way of getting
Yeah.
the data right.
Something like Oracle. Oracle's the same way. You can just never, like, oh, we're going to switch totally from Oracle. I had one customer who said, $10 million they invested in Oracle. Oh, we're getting rid of Oracle. We're changing everything over to SQL. You know what? That was like 3-4 years ago. Today, they still got a couple of Oracle databases that we can't get rid of those. They've got to stay here. So we still have to pay Oracle $10,000 a year for maintenance. Just never goes away. And you know what the real kicker is? Anybody know what other operating system that, oh, wait, one other one? Where is it? OS X. Huh? Cool. I'm a Mac guy if you don't know, so that's really awesome. Except you can't run it on, you piss off Apple if you run it on hardware other than a Apple.
Is it a Mac server, the only thing that's certified,
Yeah.
and they don't even make the main one?
It's the only thing that's certified, but yeah, there are other ways around that. Anybody know what the next one I'm going to bring up? Now, this will really show your age if you know this one. They still support it. What's that? Oh, did I forget NetWare on there? Oh, I did. I'm sorry. I forgot NetWare. That's not it, though. But I'm sorry. I didn't call that out. Actually, NetWare is one they support. I forgot that one. I apologize. No. Anybody remember this one? I saw your expression. Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Got some of that as well.
I actually met a gentleman. I don't know if you're familiar with a company called Res Software. I met a gentleman, his name is Max, and he's a head trainer for Res. He actually has a virtual machine of OS2 Warp that he fires up every once in a while just to go down memory lane or something to remember what he used to do. But that's crazy to me. That's just, you know, who would ever need Warp? That's like saying you want WinView. If you run Citrix, everybody know what WinView is? WinView is the first version of Citrix. Okay, why? Anyways, that's what we get from vSphere, right? What do we get with Hyper-V? You got somebody that comes to you and says, I need Novell, or I need Turbo Linux, or it has to run on CentOS. Well, not CentOS, bad example. It has to run on FreeBSD. It has to run on Windows 98. It has to run on Windows NT. Well, guess what? In Hyper-V version 2, version 3, that's all you get for Linux. I'm sorry? Wait, I'm not done. You're jumping ahead. That goes away. And then what goes away on the Windows side? That's it. That's it. I think this is a huge mistake from Microsoft. Huge. This is a bunch of people that at Microsoft that believe that their operating system is still king, and that you should only really concentrate your coding on the latest operating systems, which I think is wrong, because a lot of people use vSphere for the fact that you need some older operating systems. You need that capability, just like we were talking about for Lotus Notes, for Oracle, for things like that.
Yeah, but it depends on the business, how the startup or when it started.
You have to understand.
You know, if it's a small
But if
new business that's 2 years old, why would they want, you know?
But if you're in that line of thinking, then you just narrowed your market, right? You just totally narrowed your market.
Oh.
Because someone, I mean, you're talking about 2 years old being a business. What about the businesses that have been around for 5 years, 10 years, 20
that's what
years?
I'm saying. They may be selling that for new start, you know, because they were way behind from VMware in coming to market in the first place. So they're assuming, all right, any new companies look at using Hyper-V.
If they were just selling to that area, I
To
think
that
they'd be
area, yeah. They might.
restricting themselves against cloud though as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're a new business startup, why would you potentially be doing a lot of this? Why not?
I agree with
Every
you.
app is cloud-based. That's the
No,
point.
that's
Yeah. Yeah, I don't.
that is heavily important.
I understand what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with the philosophy behind that because of the fact that you really, to me, from a business perspective, you're narrowing your market too much. You know, you have people that are saying that, well, okay, great, we'll replace all of our vSphere, like, you know, take a company, PayPal. We're going to replace all of our vSphere and we're going to put Hyper-V in. But we've got these 10 applications that require Windows NT. We can't move off of it yet. Oh, guess what? I guess we'll stay with vSphere for a while. Okay? Or until we upgrade. But that could take years. So,
Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
If you've got a hypervisor which allows normal requests to go to the operating system as normal, and then intercept protected mode calls to ring 0 and has the hypervisor handle those, surely it's easier to have a hypervisor that works with everything than a hypervisor that only works with a few things. In my mind, it'd be harder to build a hypervisor that only works with certain things rather than behaves standardly with every OS on it. So how have they managed to build a hypervisor that is OS dependent?
see, I agree with what you're saying. I think that I think it's more of a philosophy type of thing behind the companies. Think of VMware when they started out with GSX, and they wanted to cover all the bases. They were like, we want to make this available to everybody. Look at VMware Workstation. It's the same way. You can cover everything. Whereas with Hyper-V, and even Zen, even, VirtualBox is a little bit different. VirtualBox has got more. But I think it's got more to do with the philosophy behind how they wanted to build the product and market the product, like you said.
This is a supported operating system.
Protected mode calls and saying, based on the OS that's running, I'm going to pretend I can't do this.
This
Yeah.
is a supported list, though, isn't it? Not a. It would potentially run 3.1, but Microsoft aren't going to help you whatsoever if the problem
Non-supported.
happens. Isn't that they've
They'd be
written code to
non-supported.
physically stop other operating systems.
Right.
working.
Right. When you go into, when you go into vSphere today with 5.1 U1, you can actually select Hyper-V as an operating system. But notice in parentheses it's unsupported. Okay, so they're, pretty much they're going to say, you do it, but you're on your own. I mean, I've successfully set up a machine that was, before they supported Windows 7, I had it set for Vista. Okay, and Windows 7 still ran. There was no problems with it.
The VMware dropping 3.1 support as of the next release as well, aren't they? So
Yeah.
I suppose another side of this is how much they have to test on every single update. If you've got that massive list, every single update you do, you have to test. Does 3.1 actually still work with
Those are-
vSphere 8? Well, actually.
Those are
I
valid.
don't even-
Yeah, those are valid arguments. Those are valid.
They're coming to a point where they're going, you know what, we don't really need to be doing it to this extensive list. Let's just concentrate on the market products that people are using.
But they don't. They do that a lot with a lot of their products, don't they? Though, when you're talking about like Office 365, things like that, let's focus on this market segment, that we really want to focus on here. We're going to dump all the old Office users, things like that. So if you think about it, there's a little bit of philosophy behind that, a little bit of culture.
Everything has a life cycle, innit?
Yep.
They get to a point and go, right, you know what?
Yep.
It might have cost to make sure that's upgradable and compatible when we move from this version to that.
Right.
The difference is VMware will continue supporting 3.1 on the legacy hypervisors until it ends of life in, was it 5 years or whatever, it goes
Yeah.
out of support. So.
Yeah. No, that's good
I guess
discussion.
It's being competitive, isn't it? They've got to be out there and
Yep.
have their product ready and done and dusted.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good discussion. I like this.
If they spend too much time making the legacy work, they get it.
Yep. I agree. I agree with that. I agree with that, but I also agree that there should be something there that says, we still recognize that we need to look at this, or in the client version of Hyper-V, we need to look at this, not necessarily the server version. Okay, moving on. Hyper-V, what about these? When we look at it from a VMware perspective, we have hot add, hot remove, okay? Fault tolerance, FT, which 5.1 U1, I believe it's still limited to one proc. They haven't changed that at all. They promised that when 5.0 came out, they were going to change. They never did.
Not going to see that for long.
Right. DRS, DPM, and data protection. These are all terms that you're familiar with, being VMware administrators, right? And host profiles, okay? Microsoft's answer to this, okay, from the Hyper-V standpoint, is Operations Manager, SCCM or SCVMM, okay? It's not native inside of, like, vCenter. To do a lot of this stuff, you need vCenter, right? Okay? Well, in Hyper-V, you need SCVMM to do a lot of this.
Your costs becoming.
Cost, exactly. That's one of the points I was going to make. Thank you very much. Costs pretty much become equal. How much is vCenter today? $5,000? $5,000 American? Okay. SCVMM? Anybody know? It's the price of a cow. The server doesn't cost anything. It's actually just the cost of the enterprise cow. But when you start getting an operations manager, you start getting into the overhead of trying to administer all that, and SCCM and everything else, they kind of balance out. What about you? They want you to be Superman. Well, that's from America. I actually Googled the Britain heroes, superheroes, and for some reason they came up with, or this is our version of Superman today. Anybody know who that is? That's Iron Man. Yeah, that's our Superman today. But I Googled for Britain superheroes, and they came up with this guy, Captain Britain. They actually called. They had a comic book cover that said Captain Britain. This is Captain Britain. And that's what he looks like, and that's what he was in the comic book. I guess. And then you have this, of course, you're 007, which really isn't a superhero. There's been so many of those guys. I mean, can you count them all? There's been like 7, 8, 9. That have Roger Moore was probably the best, in my opinion. But then I was like, okay, there's got to be more than that over here in England. There's got to be more than that. So I go out and I Google it again, but I Google on google.co.uk. And this is what I come up with. I love this guy. But this is what I came up with when I did the Google. This is what he came up. And I think it's because he was in the Olympics last year or something like that, but he's great. But this is what they want you to be. Not exactly him, but they want you to be a superhero. They want you to be able to manage both of them. Okay? So well, let's look at the basics of what you'd be doing. A lot of tasks are accomplished the same way. Create a guest, power control, the guest settings, create the storage, connecting to a guest. Snapshots are pretty much the same across Hyper-V. Hyper-V doesn't have a nice GUI for snapshots like VMware does. You know, they have that snapshot manager that shows you the pretty pictures with the arrows and the triangles and all that. Well, Hyper-V doesn't have that, but you can do basically the same thing. Tools installation, the resource allocation, updates and patches, templates and clones. I will say that templates and clones are done a little bit differently just because of terminology, which I'll get to. But updates and patches, obviously those are done differently, okay? But they're pretty much the same. You're applying patches through Update Manager with vSphere, or you're doing it via the CLI, doing the patch upgrades. Well, in Windows, you're using WSUS or SCCM or Windows Update or whatever you're doing. You're pretty much doing the same thing, okay? Or PowerShell to update a Hyper-V server.
Have Microsoft commented on how major version updates are going to happen in the future? Because between 2008 and 2012, it's a disruptive upgrade. There's no way of seamlessly moving your VM from a 2008 Hyper-V cluster to
Yes.
a 2012.
Yes, that has become a point of contention, and there will be a seamless way to do that, but they will require SCVMM to do it. So some of the terminology difference you should know about: move guests from host, so they call it vMotion. Hyper-V calls it live migration, guest storage, so on and so forth. Quick storage migration, data stores and volumes. They actually have, Microsoft is pushing this storage nothing now, which means you don't have to have anything shared, and you can have a USB. You can put everything on a USB stick if you want. Data center versus fabric, scripting, PowerCLI and workflows, PowerShell and runbooks in orchestrators. They both have an orchestrator product, if you didn't know that, within the vSphere orchestrator and the SC Operations Manager orchestrator. Dynamic Core Resources, DRS, and they have something called PRO, which I spelled that wrong, Performance and Resource Optimizations. High availability, HA, failover clustering, guest memory allocation, and DR. What's interesting is the different DR, SRM, and replica. This costs a lot of money. And they changed the pricing model, I think. I don't use SRM. They changed the pricing model 5.0 to per machine, didn't they? So it used to be you pay one price for everything. Now they do it per machine. That can get expensive.
As long as you're under 75, you're laughing, because then you go for the standard edition. But
Yeah.
as soon as you go over to the 76, you're paying free.
Yeah.
Two-thirds more.
Yeah, yeah.
5.1's got replica built into the core product now, host-based replication, so you don't have to buy it.
Right. Yeah, with the replication, but not SRM capability with
You can't
scripting.
test it.
What's that?
With 5.1, the vSphere replication, you can't test it. So in my
Oh, you can't test it. So the SRM, I see, I'm not familiar with SRM because I never use it.
So SRM, the beauty is you can test it, and Hyper-V, the free version, you can also test it. The free version of replication in vSphere, there's no way of testing it unless you're going to do a failover.
Oh, you can't do it. Oh, okay. So there's no way to actually do a DR
So
test.
what use is a DR product if you can't actually test that your DR is working?
Okay. Good to know. Some of the disk files, you're probably used to working with these if you are administrators. You actually have to go down to the disk file. I've had to do this. I'm sure some of you have had to do it where you actually have to go in and modify. You manually modify some of the disk files, or you know, change the location of a disk. I mean, we had to do that. And you know, back in the 3.5 days, you couldn't easily just storage motion a disk to change the name of the machine. You know, when you storage motion a machine, it'll change the name. Well, in the old version, you couldn't do that. You had to go into the VMX file and actually manually change it. So this is some of the different disk types. or the disk file extensions, and the file extensions for like the virtual. I don't know. Anybody use virtual floppy? Anybody use floppies anymore? Okay. I suppose if you're going to put NetWare on, you know, you got to have a floppy, right? That's the only way NetWare goes on. If you're using, you know, it's, okay. So how do we manage them? Well, in vSphere we have vCenter, right? Then you have to have the vCenter client, which I think when 5.0 came out, I was amazed how big that thing has ballooned. It's like 300 meg now or something like that. The help files alone are like crazy in size. Along with the vCenter client, you also have what now? The web, right? Which eventually, or can everybody say Horizon? We'll be going to that, going to the web-based client. You have vCLI. The VMA, I don't even know, is the VMA still relevant? Do they still have that appliance, that virtual appliance, a VMA you can put out there and manage using those VI commands? Okay. PowerCLI, and you have some third party. I haven't found any third parties in all my days of working with vSphere. I've never found a third party that actually just takes all the management and puts it into another interface. They'll do little pieces. Like one of them is Foglight. vFoglight I've worked with a lot. And you can start and stop and restart a machine and things like that. But you can't manage everything. You can't like move a machine. You can't do anything. I've never, what's that?
Robotics is good for automating. Rather than using alternative as management, you can automate those processes. So
right.
a more simple user can maybe do.
Right. Any other third parties that anybody uses to manage vSphere?
There's one on Android. You have to pay for each module, for the
Oh.
networking and the storage, and for starting and stopping the machine.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
PowerGUI is another one. Obviously, it uses PowerCLI behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Then on the Hyper-V side, we have the virtual machine manager. That comes with, when you enable the Hyper-V role, one of the options is VMM, System Center Virtual Machine Manager, Service Console. There is a Service Console. It's not the Service Console you're used to in ESX. This is just if you think of core, think of server core, that's the console that you get. PowerShell, obviously. And then third party, there's something called 5.9s, which is a huge vendor of Hyper-V management and co-products that work with SCOM, Operations Manager Suite. HV Remote, and then something called vUtilities. vUtilities used to be free, now they make you pay for it, but it was a pretty good product. So why not SCVMM for VMware? This is VMware's argument. On VMware's white paper, they say, why trying to use SCVMM 2012 will frustrate vSphere administrators. Microsoft is trying to convince vSphere administrators to manage their VMware environment using System Center VMM. However, vSphere administrators will find that SCVMM does this. Increases complexity while adding little value. I don't know, vCenter's got kind of complex, unless you've been working in it a while. They got added all the third-party add-ons, the disk add-ons, everything else that you throw in there. vCenter is not exactly not complicated by default, number one, but also SCVMM does a lot more than just, it integrates with the whole Operations Manager Suite. So it does everything. It's not a single pane of glass. vCenter server is still required. It's not exactly true. You can still do things in SCVMM. Okay, you just can't do everything. Okay, you can still do some things. You just can't do everything. Adds new overheads, delivers little benefit, degrades operating, blah, 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 blah. Offers only rudimentary management, VMware my frustration, blah, blah, blah. To me, this is them going at it again. I don't like you. I'm going to make everybody hate you, so on and so forth. They're just going to sit there and battle it out. And what happens is everybody gets hit with FUD. Everybody know what FUD is?
No.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And what that does is it's one vendor saying your lives are going to suck if you try and use SCVMM to manage VMware. Okay? or Microsoft comes out and your lives are going to suck if you try and use any other management tool to manage our hypervisor. Okay? They're just, it's just creating that. And FUD goes beyond just technology. I mean, FUD can be used for anything. They used to use it in the old war days with the propaganda. They used to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So beyond all that, we're administrators. We really don't need to hear that. We don't need to deal with that. We try and avoid that. I try and avoid it whenever possible. So let's talk a little bit about cross-platform. You have migration tools, okay? They will migrate a virtual machine from one platform to another, either hot or cold, okay? But they're not management tools. All they'll do is they'll take a VMDK file and make it into a VHD file, or a VHD file into a VMDK file, or so on and so forth. That's all they do. Microsoft has a plugin that does that, okay? That goes into vCenter. You can right-click on a machine and say, migrate to Hyper-V. It'll take a VMDK and put it right over to a Hyper-V cluster. VMware has Converter, right? They still have Converter. They took away the enterprise. Now they have that standalone converter. That's what I was saying. VMware Multi-Hypervisor Manager, the MHM, they came out with it. So it was a fling eventually. You know what a fling is with VMware? It's a lab thing. VMware doesn't officially support them. They have a bunch of engineers that just throw their stuff together and put it out on something called flings.vmware.com. And they're just little things that they create on the side. Well, this became something that Microsoft or VMware turned into a product. Okay? The problem is that it really doesn't manage. It does basically start, stop, restart, you know, things like that, and conversions. That's about it. Hotlink is another vCenter plugin. They won Best of VMworld 2012. I was a judge for that on the management side. They won it because their product is really revolutionary in terms of they're trying to get everybody to understand that there's more than one hypervisor in a data center. And they're taking the approach, the wrong approach, I believe, and I've expressed this to them, is that they're requiring it to be a virtual center plugin. You can't do that. You can't rely on another vendor's product to, you know, do this type of management. It has to be standalone. It should be standalone, or it should communicate. But they're requiring it as a plugin. It's not a standalone product. SCVMM, although VMware disagrees, that's what I just read to you, is that PDF. That's their white paper on it. And I don't know if there are any others anybody uses besides Ambiotics or anything like that. Does anybody use PowerShell? Nobody uses PowerShell? Okay. Okay. I am a huge PowerShell fanatic. This is a single pane of glass. It's a picture of a single pane of glass. But what does PowerShell give you? You can manage both environments, vSphere and Hyper-V, Zen server, if you wanted to, inside of a single PowerShell console. And the reason for that is because these vendors have adopted, first of all, Microsoft adopted, because they created the damn thing, PowerShell, right? Which is a task-based scripting language. They created it, so everything that they do runs PowerShell. VMware came out, I think in 3.5 was the first time they came out with something called PowerCLI. Okay, that was created actually by 2 people inside of VMware. One of those persons is no longer with VMware, and they were actually shot down by the internal people on PowerCLI. PowerCLI started out as a product that was done outside of work hours, outside of VMware. One of the gentlemen that created it, I know him, and he created it along with a partner of his, and the product team that makes vCenter came down and said, we won't allow this because we need to sell vCenter. We don't want another management tool. We don't want to offer another management tool. We already have the VMA, which is coming out. We already have the vCLI, At that time, they had ESX with the Service Council, but they pretty much said, you're not going to create this on VMware time. You're not going to do it, period. So they took it out of house. They created it out of house. Well, after some lashback, when people saw this and they VMware administrators like yourself said, hey, this is awesome. This is what we need to do. This is PowerShell. This is something we have to learn because all the products that we use now are going to PowerShell, Exchange, you know, the Microsoft side, on the Citrix side, all that kind of stuff, we're all starting to use PowerShell. So they came back and they said, you got to allow this. And vCenter product people backed off and said, oh, okay. Go ahead, you can do it, but you're going to be kind of like the rogue group. So we're going to put you in the community workspace, but we're not going to put you in the main download workspace. You're going to be a community item. Okay, so they're still kind of out there. And Luke Deakins, I think that's pronounce his name. He's not the gentleman that I know that no longer works for VMware, but he is still there, and he still, you know, pioneers that effort. But PowerCLI is something that is phenomenal if you haven't used it from vSphere, managing vSphere.
They won a load of Microsoft awards for it, didn't they, for PowerShell integration, best PowerShell integration products and
Yeah.
things like that, and it actually meant Microsoft had to pick up what they were doing with Hyper-V.
Yeah, yeah. So that's where you get the marriage of PowerShell, and this is the symbol for PowerCLI. Okay, with single pane of glass. Basically, what you're doing, and what is all this keep calm stuff? I mean, what's with the British and this keep calm? I mean, we walk into those souvenir stores and they had keep calm like plastered everywhere, and you can keep calm this, keep calm that, keep calm. And I found these, PowerShell on and use PowerCLI. I didn't make these up. These are real. So.
The real answer is it was a home office thing. The British were worried about a German invasion, and if the Germans ever came over, they were going to have these posters that we put up to tell people to keep calm. It was found in the archives, you know, God knows how many years later, and suddenly it just became a
Really?
thing.
So everybody now is just taking off, keep calm everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So with PowerShell and PowerCLI, the Hyper-V commandlets are native to the new PowerShell. So if you install Windows 8 or 2012 server, the PowerShell, the Hyper-V commandlets are there when you enable the Hyper-V role. Okay? You can't get those commandlets unless you enable the role. All right? It has to be enabled, or you enable the checkbox that says PowerShell commandlets and disable the Hyper-V role. You can do that, so you just get the commandlets. But they don't spell that out. You have one checkbox and it automatically checks the other two. So, Windows 7 cannot manage Hyper-V 3, and Win 8 cannot manage Hyper-V 2. For some reason, and this is one of the biggest bitches on the forums, is why they did this. It's the same thing as RSAT. Anybody use RSAT to manage your Windows environments? The remote server administration tools? You can't cross between versions. They're going to fix that, but I don't know why they did that. PowerCLI is somewhat vSphere version dependent and requires VIX. There is an API that has to be installed. Whenever you install PowerCLI, it'll come up and say, need to install VIX. It's just an API that runs in the background. Multiple PowerCLI packages for other products. Update Manager, you have to download the modules for Update Manager. I think I don't know if you have to download one for the other products now that are coming out. Horizon, I think they're going to have a separate one, and it's not going to be native. And then you can run both together, but you have to watch out, okay? And the reason for that is because VMware, in the PowerCLI world, the guys who run this as a community thing, in whatever reason, if you remember, the old way of doing things was snap-ins. I don't know if anybody's familiar. I apologize if you haven't worked with PowerShell that much, but in the world of PowerShell, you load modules or you load commandlets by either, in the old way, doing snap-ins, and now it's modules. Well, PowerCLI, for whatever reason, hasn't evolved in the last 3 years to make it a module. It requires a snap-in. That causes a problem. And the reason for that is because both Hyper-V and vSphere call their commandlets the exact same names. Get-VM is the same for Hyper-V and vSphere. So when you do a get-VM from the command line, it picks the first one in the list, which just happens to be vSphere, PowerCLI. It comes up in the list first before Hyper-V does. Okay? So what you have to do is you enable the Hyper-V role, you install PowerCLI, modify your PowerShell profile, they add the snap-ins, then you run in PowerShell and you set the execution policy, and then you have to, whenever you run commandlets, you have to prefix the commandlets with the module name. Okay? And then find out what the prefixes are, you run this command. And it'll tell you, okay, what the group name is. That group name is the module name. It'll tell you that the module is hyper-v, or VMware Vim automation, I believe it's called, or something like that. So you have to prefix the command with that. Okay? That's the only way you can do that in terms of having to manage it from a single pane of glass. Okay? I was going to do a little bit of a demo. I guess I've talked way too much. Yeah, I'm sorry, Jackie. The only demo I was going to show you really was using the PowerCLI and things like that, so I apologize. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
You mentioned the difference in disk is different between VMware and Hyper-V, where Microsoft call it difference in disk. And
They have child and parent disks, they call it.
Link clone. So what is the principal difference between the two?
Well, the principal difference is that Microsoft uses something called parent and child disks.
Yeah.
Okay, and what they do is they take the different. They call it a differencing disk, where they'll take how VMware has a clone. Okay, the link clone, so it'll contain all the deltas.
Yeah.
Okay, that'll go off. The same thing with Microsoft, but they call it that when they bring their parent and child together. Okay, you can only have one child per parent. In link clones, you can have multiple link clones. You can only have one. Okay, in Hyper-V.
So does that mean you have to keep creating more parents? Oh, I see.
Yes, yes, exactly. Which makes administration much. Yeah.
Okay.
Does anybody have any other more questions? Yes, sir.
Quick question, actually to the group really. The Newman technology, does anyone actually ever use that? Newman support?
Anyone? Oh.
It sounds a really interesting feature. I can see kind of where it could go. But yeah, if no one's going to use it, then really it may be too soon for it.
Exactly, exactly. It could be just a little bit early for that,
Yeah, it's early.
for adoption. Yep. Yes, sir.
In your experience, is Hyper-V without all the SCOM and SCVVM or all the other whatever letters we want to say it is to manage it, is that a viable solution for a business? Because obviously if we're going to compare the base Hyper-V that comes with 2012 against VMware's vCenter and the whole suite, then there's a significant reason to move to Hyper-V. And what I struggle with is actually, is that a business-ready solution on its own without all the other bits?
One of the things I always, and this is an argument, but also a conversation that takes place, and there are a lot of factors that go into that decision, obviously, right? There's your current infrastructure, there's your costs involved, what commitments you already have, and where you see yourself in 5 years, okay, the vision. My experience with Hyper-V version 3, I have customers that have moved that into the enterprise, okay? And I've had one customer, one very large customer that we just worked with as late as last week that actually is moving their entire vSphere over to Hyper-V.
With SCOM or without SCOM?
With SCOM, yeah, with the entire SCOM suite. And the biggest reason is because it's almost an upsell when you do a large migration. Now, for smaller shops, SCOM doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. You know, for larger enterprises, we're talking they have 6,000 servers, you know, in one data center in California. So they made sense because they were managing their laptops and their desktops and with SCCM, and it made sense to move under the whole SCOM umbrella.
The converter tool, haven't they made that part of SCOM now? So if
Yes.
you want to do a conversion,
It's part of
you need
SCCM.
SCOM. Yeah.
Yeah, SCCM 2012 SP1. Yes.
I'll take it they're still third-party tools you could use if you didn't
Yes.
want to go for the whole.
Well, and the converter tool that you plug into vCenter is free. Plus, the standalone converter tool is also free. So you can download a standalone that is the actual module that's in SCCM, but it's a standalone. You can download it. The Microsoft or VMware converter or whatever it is. You can search on
But if
TechNet.
you want to do P2Vs, then you
Yep.
need either a third party or
Yep.
Scrum to do it.
Right. You don't have to go third-party Microsoft saying we're just going to give you this to you for free. But
Managing,
just one moment. To answer your question, in my personal opinion, I believe that Hyper-V version 3 is ready for the enterprise. 2008 R2, no way in hell. But
But with or without Scrum, is it ready for the enterprise, or do you think both are now
I think
ready,
both are.
as long as it
Absolutely.
fits with your requirements?
especially with 2012 SP1. 2012 SP1 on the operations manager side really is changing. Not only that, but just so you know, down the road here, you're going to see changes with the Systems Center Operations Suite, the whole cloud movement. You're going to see that actually move into the cloud.
And
Okay, so
from your experience, if it's a small shop, 100, 200 VMs, what parts of that SCOM suite do you recommend that they install first?
SCCM.
So it's just that one component rather than...
If you have an EA, if you have to purchase an agreement, you have the Enterprise CAL or even the Core CAL. The Core CAL includes the SCCM agent now. The server costs nothing. So you can put SCCM in your environment today.
I think if you look at what you're getting when you're buying that CAL,
Right.
you then look at what would be involved in installing and configuring all of that. You go, well, I haven't got the time, or I don't want to pay for the consultancy to
Yes.
do all of that, and it's picking the components of that are the must-have components.
I think that's a conversation and a discussion that will go on with for a long time. And depending on your business, you know, I deal with multiple businesses. I don't know how many people are consultants in here, but you deal with multiple businesses, and you hear it from both sides. And it really depends on the customer and their business. So, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, we manage our templates within the VMware environment using
Yeah.
Shavlik, which
Oh,
converts
Shavlik?
the template back to a VM, patches it, and then converts it back, all automated. What would you be doing in the Hyper-V world?
Nothing right now.
You have to
SCC,
manually do
you'll
it,
be doing an
'cause that's
SCCM.
all automated by Shavlik.
Right. Orchestrator and SCCM will, SP2 down the road
But
here?
that's somewhere down the road.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Just a comment about the 100 to 200 VMs. If you were to have 100 to 200 VMs on the system center, as in SCOM, SC, VVM, and Operations Manager, you'd end up with more servers running system center than actual hypervisors running the virtual machine.
And that you are correct in that.
My view on the system center and whatever else is, by the time you've paid for the first SQL server to even think about installing system center, it's already more expensive than
Unless you have the multiple uses for that infrastructure, like SCCM, you're managing your desktops, your laptops, you're doing your Windows updates, you're doing all that other ancillary software package distribution and all that, then that cost kind of balances out. But if you're just using it to manage your hypervisor, no way. Yeah.
amputating your legs a perfectly way of dealing with an ingrown toenail, but
Yeah.
it's going to be fine.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.